Former chairman of the Trump campaign is trying to sleep tonight in a federal prison, contemplating the possibility of spending every night for the rest of his life in a federal prison. 69-year-old Paul Manafort heard the word guilty 8 times today from a federal jury in Virginia, who remained undecided on 10 other counts Paul Manafort faced. Manafort was convicted of every category of crime he was accused of: tax fraud, bank fraud, and failure to report a foreign bank account. But the jury was undecided on other similar counts. Paul Manafort faces already a maximum of 80 years in prison for today's convictions. And more immediately, he faces a second trial in federal court in Washington, D.C., in a courthouse where jurors are thought to be less sympathetic to accused white-collar criminals like Paul Manafort, and where the judge will not be taking every opportunity to try to help the Manafort defense, as Reagan-appointed Judge Thomas Ellis did on a daily basis in this first Manafort trial. The typical public comment from defense lawyers after a defeat like this one today for Paul Manafort includes the mandatory promise to continue to fight the case on appeal, fight it all the way. But that is not what we heard from Paul Manafort's lawyer today.
He would like to thank Judge Ellis for granting him a fair trial, thank the jury for their very long and hard-fought deliberations. He is evaluating all of his options at this point.
Evaluating all of his options. That includes how much money does he want to spend on his next criminal trial, which he's even more likely to lose than the one he just lost. Another option is, of course, what does Paul Manafort know that he can tell Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller in order to avoid spending the rest of his life in prison? Joining us now, Gene Rossi, a former federal prosecutor and former assistant U.S. attorney in that Eastern District of Virginia where the trial was held, and Ken Dilanian, intelligence and national security reporter for NBC News. He was outside the courthouse today as the jury was returning that verdict. And Ken Dilanian, tell us about that anticipation today. The questions that the jury had sent indicated a little bit of confusion today of were they asking the judge about what happens if they can't reach a verdict on just one count? And then shortly after that, it turns out the jury comes back with the 8 convictions.
Yeah, Lawrence, now we know that what they meant was for any of the counts that they're deadlocked on, they were asking the judge essentially, what do we do and how do we fill out the jury form and how does it affect the final verdict? And it turns out they were deadlocked on 10 counts. And the judge asked them to go back and deliberate, and they did that for about 4 hours. And apparently they could not reach consensus. And I think what this tells us a couple of things. One, Manafort's lawyers actually did a pretty good job in the face of overwhelming evidence and a terrific presentation by the prosecution, a powerful presentation. Manafort's lawyers were able to raise some doubts in the minds of some jurors on 10 of the 18 counts. But that's really irrelevant for Paul Manafort because he's a convicted felon, or will be when the judge passes sentence. 8 counts of felony convictions of tax fraud, bank fraud, and failure to declare a foreign bank account is a victory for the prosecution. No other way to look at it. A huge vindication for Robert Mueller and his team in their first test in a major trial. And the other thing we can say, I think, is that this jury did not appear to be swayed by any of the noise, any of Donald Trump's comments. I mean, honestly, we don't know whether the jurors, were looking at outside news coverage or weren't, whether they heard this stuff. But if they did, it didn't seem to affect them because, as you said, they convicted on each part of the 3 tranches, the 3 categories of charges. And they appeared to do so thoughtfully. And, some counts persuaded jurors more than others. Clearly. But at the end of the day, Paul Manafort is facing some 7 to 9 years in prison just on these charges alone.
Gene Rossi, your reaction to the result today and what you think Paul Manafort's lawyer meant when he said he is evaluating all his options.
I think this was a tremendous victory for Robert Mueller's office. I worked closely with 2 attorneys on the Manafort trial team for the government. And I know pretty well the three of the defense attorneys for Paul Manafort. And I got to say that Paul Manafort's defense team did a fantastic job. Trials are like poker, and they had a very terrible hand, and they did the best they could. Let me talk about the options. The one option, of course, is to do a Pickett's charge, to appeal this case to the Supreme Court of the United States, and to go into D.C. and just to fight, and just hope for a pardon, a commutation, or an acquittal, and a reversal in the Fourth Circuit. That's not going to happen. The most likely option I would recommend if I were his attorney is to cooperate. What you have now are two battles still pending. One, you have the mistrial counts that academically, theoretically could be brought by the prosecutors in EDVA. That's one battle. You obviously have the trial in D.C. So I would go to the prosecutors and I would say this: I can't fight anymore. What can you offer me? And I think the prosecutors would say we would dismiss the charges in D.C., maybe have them plead to 1001 or a minor charge. We won't retry the counts in EDVA. And the prosecutors would say, okay, let's talk about the Trump Tower meeting. Let's talk about the Republican platform when you, Paul Manafort, helped negotiate a removal or an amendment of something having to do with Russia. Let's talk about what happened in August and September, possibly. There's a lot of things that could be given to the prosecutors. And here's something that nobody has talked about since last week. There was a sidebar when Rick Gates was testifying. It is now under seal. It will become unsealed if the prosecutors don't go forward on the retrial. That sidebar, based on my experience, was this: Rick Gates is cooperating big time about the campaign, about the transition, about the Trump organization, and I'm sure Paul Manafort has the same information ×5. So those are the options that Kevin Downey, who's a fantastic attorney, did a great job. Those are the options that I think he was talking about.
Gene Rossi, Ken Delaney, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.